I was sitting there quite interested because I hadn't worked out how I was going to follow the relay race. Everybody else had worked that out by now, but I've got there. I've got there now. So it's about linking things up. So I've got to think of something to say about that. Then I've talked a little bit in the past about our role in all of this, which is to do exactly that: is to draw together some data from various sources, which is not quite as easy as it sounds. And then present it in some perhaps interesting ways, in some ways that we want some feedback from people about sorts of things they'd like to see. And then I think, and both of those things are not insignificant in their own right, but they are done and have been done over time in many different ways as kind of one-off exercises, or rather high-effort exercises. People rushing around collecting data is not unusual. Sticking it in an Excel spreadsheet and making a nice graph is not unusual, but I don't diminish that effort. But the third thing that I tend to go on about a bit is trying to make some of this able to be embedded in daily lives. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that the data is highly accessible, that those processes are byproducts as much as possible of day-to-day life. They don't need an enormous amount of effort, except perhaps for a one-off effort to make everything work on each occasion. And we've been making some progress on some of that. There's some work that we did a little while ago which drew together information from the community system about people on community matron caseloads, combined that with data about emergency admissions, unplanned admissions, which is drawing data rather indirectly from our hospitals and also from our local community. And we have some, I haven't got them here, but I invite people at the moment to suggest they might have a look at these things. We have some quite interesting graphs that illustrate what I think actually quite a clear relationship between unplanned admissions and people coming onto case management, people coming onto community matron caseloads. And what we've done is make that available through the Trust intranet, so it's actually available to anyone, as it were. And having made that effort, that data, in as far as we have data sources, is up to date all the time. We haven't got people rushing around collecting that data now. That process has been put in place, and now that happens. And what we're doing is wanting to extend that in other interesting ways. And one of the ones we were looking at recently, we're looking at a number of metrics where one of the presentation methods, you'll see that behind these are next slides, this. I'm going to go forwards and then back. Don't worry about the detail, it should be illegible because I realise the names are particularly. But one of the things that we're doing with some of this data, both comparative and in some ways non-comparative, it is to allow people to get straight onto the intranet. This is just our intranet, there's nothing very clever about it. You know the magic URL, and you can get onto it, and allow people to examine some metrics, and with all sorts of metrics to do with admissions and communications and planned and unplanned events, such as episodes and consultations and so on in primary care and secondary care, and also in community. That's fine across the board. And then to allow people to compare their particular area of interest, and the example here is one practice, against some other comparable grouping. And in this particular example, what we've got is one practice comparing, in this particular case, emergency admissions against the reddish bars, which are the same metric normalised for the entire cluster in that particular case. And what I wanted to just point out was that these sorts of things are not, bear with me, because these sorts of things are not that unusual. The point is that we're drawing together data from actually rather disparate sources, so not very much, but in particular we're delivering it to people who need it, who are interested in it, and who can make use of it on demand when they need it, and to a considerable extent under their control. So, for example, the point that's being made here is, who can go on here and pick a particular surgery to act as the focus of interest. And then some of these other drop-downs allow you, for example, this one, mock diagnosis, not quite the right label, because that one actually drops down to, say, dementia and diabetes, and in fact the topics we have here, And then there's a comparator, which currently reads LCG, but in fact, that comparator at the moment does focus around the space commissioning groups, but also will have wider comparators, so we'll be able to look right across the Ealing area, and then right across the consortium, and then potentially think right across the new cluster. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to say, and it's a good illustration of where we're up to.
So, permissions and passwords permitting, each of the practices involved in Southall can press the button, compare themselves about the whole of Southall, or the whole of Ealing, or maybe the whole of London, in the indices to do with diabetes, mental health, and so on, that we choose to measure. And that we intend to do. In fact, extend that idea to many other things of interest. Now, there's clearly governance and permissions issues here, but the potential to do is to help people to learn with real live, routinely gathered data is enormous, and we've got to leave on that way. Okay, the next image of organisation, boundary spanning. So, very often in the NHS we encounter seemingly impenetrable boundaries. And of course, some people get curious about these things, I'm sure, to look over them, because very interesting things are on the other. In fact, everyone's lives are terribly interesting when you understand them. But it's not so easy to get that information back in order to allow cross-pollination of ideas. You need more semi-permeable membranes and more agile leaders who can jump over and gather intelligence from other places and form friendships from other places. And we're really talking here about bridge building. How do you, of course, in war, bridges are the first things that are bombed. You understand how valuable they are to the enemy. But how about creating an NHS where creating and crossing bridges imaginatively in every possible direction is the norm? Actually, that's how we construct our relationships rather than bureaucratic processes. Community learning, the last image. Actually, what we're doing is creating a community, or maybe multiple overlapping communities, because what is a community but a network of relationships? And we're allowing the possibility of relationships to happen in lots of different areas that builds trust, and allow more people to cross those boundaries wisely and timely in order to build on the things. So it's pretty important that these things go on and on and on. And some of you may know that there's a rather hefty funding crisis around our necks, and we need to embed before the end of March enough of these sustainable structures such that it survives what happens next. The Southall initiative will not achieve unless it goes on and on and on year. You can't stop and start something like this. It just fragments things too much. It can't, it doesn't work very well. So the third image is community learning. What we've got here is a community or multiple communities learning together. Now, learning is obviously very valuable when you're immediately up close to it, and we all understand that importance. But it is less obvious the moment you leave the room and you have to do it in a distance. So you have this idea of trust that maybe you kind of get in the room, but you're never quite sure if that will sustain. And very quickly, a few weeks later, this is the kind of thing that happens if you don't rebuild those kind of trusted things, and the learning ceases. So, how do you think about organisation learning in large groups? Well, first you've got everyone pointing in the same direction. That business of the right hand or left hand side of the road is no use in doing what we have done in the NHS so much as deciding, I'll drive whichever way of the road seems fine to me at the moment. But that has to go. They point in the same direction. And you form inside the big sort of people going to see little mini groups that have got their sort of like decked out for their pilot projects, through which they learn coordinated action. And this is the difficult one. It's still difficult to describe how that sort of discrete work of people in paddle boats translates to whole community network learning, because it's just too diffuse and difficult to describe. And that's just ripples. If you didn't catch the link, to me a little while. They produced all this and that kind of stuff. What's that mean? And then she tried to explain it to me and I understood. And that's my key theme on.